Yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, so there's a few. One, there is no state inside of this component. These are passed as props.
Okay.
That has to be props because there's no state here.
Right.
And this data has to be passed in. Current user has to be a prop.
Oh,
right?
Right.
If you're going to pass current user into this component and use it,
right,
then you need to say current.
Right, because this is out there. Oh,
That would give you, that would take the state current user, so this object here.
Oh, okay, I see it. Props,
and it'll pass it in as a prop, current user. So this dot props dot current user is going to be equal to this object here, which has a name. So then you say that your placeholder is going. Oh, I see. Oh, with input, I don't know if you can. But this is actually pretty. This is not necessary because you've taken some string and you're evaluating the string.
Oh, interesting.
Because you're in. This is like JavaScript land now.
Right.
So now, if you wanted to say. That would be okay.
Right.
But to just do this would make more sense as. Now let's try this out. Props.current. Props. Let's take a look at it after.
Yeah.
But I think like we're very close to it. I'm just not sure exactly what it's saying.
The logic I understand.
Yeah. Can you still call them hot dogs? Can you still call them hot dogs? Love cold hot dogs. Yeah. But you don't want to call them just dogs because that's kind of weird. Yeah, exactly. So it's a tough one. It's a conundrum they call it, right? Bit of a conundrum. Hot dogs. Can you hear us? Great. Oh yeah, there we go. Split screen. 100% after, yeah. We'll get started on this, but then afterwards I got time. Okay. Well, let's get started. Can you hear me, Victoria? I know that we've been having sound issues lately. Please let me know if it cuts out completely or if it stops. You can't understand what I'm saying. But for now, I'm going to have to assume that it's working because I've got on the screen it says I've got a mic. Is it better if I speak closer to it like this? Okay, let's do 2 sound tests. This is normal. It's a normal sound test. This is me not holding the mic closer to my mouth. This is when I bring the mic closer to my mouth. Does this sound better if I bring it closer to my mouth? Nope. Okay. So I'll have to leave it like this then. Yeah, I don't know what to say. Okay, cool. I'll leave it here, and then we'll just get started. And if it does cut out for too long, please note it, and then we'll go back and I can repeat what I have to say, or we can get back together afterwards and sort of deal with anything that got missed. But if it cuts out for more than a couple seconds, let me know. Thank you. You got it working? Okay, great. No problem. Oh, so it's not just audio, it might be this. Okay. I can do about that right now. Okay. I'm going to get started because we want to make sure we have enough time for this. All right, let's get started, please. Good to go? So here's a reminder. The app that we're building, it all comes down to this. It describes to us the structure and the state of our application. And I hope that now that you've worked a little bit more with React, this is making a bit more sense. Does anyone feel more lost than this morning? A little bit more lost than you started. Okay. A little bit over here as well. Okay. Yeah. Does anybody have questions before we get started on anything that they dealt with today? Anything that was kind of unclear to them? Kind of go where we left off, I guess. Yeah. Let's do that. So where we left off was a really important part because it's the part where we start to pass functions around and trigger events based on clicks and all that kind of stuff and post messages, just like you'll do with Chatty app. When you type in that chat bar and you hit enter, it needs to send a message to the app component to let it know that there's a new message available. It has to call a function on the app component. So we're around here on section number 12, step number 12. Pass a function to the header that it can call when a new post is created. Does that make sense? App passes a function to the header, and header just calls it whenever a new post is created. So we'll do that. What we end up doing in here is we create the onNewPost method, and the onNewPost method receives maybe some content. That would just be a variable, like just a string or something that this function will receive. And when it receives that, for now, we're just going to log it out. We're just going to make sure that the connection is working between these two things. Now, this function has to be called by the header. So in that case, we're going to pass it to the header, and we're going to say onPost is equal to this.onNewPost. Now, you'll notice I didn't call them the same thing. That's okay. I could call it I could say onNewPost here. That's fine too. These things do not have to be the same names. You don't have to make those match. What I've done here is I've just created a function, a reference to a function, and I decided that header is going to have a property called onPost. So when it's ready, it'll say this.props.onPost. It'll pass it in a piece of data, and that will actually call this function here in the app. Because the pseudocode is stuff like when receiving content, add content to posts array. That's kind of what we want to do with this eventually. With your messages, that's what you want to do. Post a new message, we want to add it to the list of messages, so when it re-renders, it shows that new message. So I'm going to pass this into header, and in header, I can use that. I can use that when I click this button down here. On click for the post button, that's going to equal this.props.onPost. Okay? And what we had said is that we're going to pass it content. So here, we're going to pass it content, and it's going to log that content out. That actually means we have to handle it a little bit differently. It means we can't just pass this function as a reference. Because if we did, then when we clicked it, onNewPost would get the event, not content. So we're going to wrap this up one more time here, and we're going to say that the onClick function here, this takes an event, but when we actually trigger this function here that takes the event, what we do is we pass this.state.content. So this .state.content is this item right here. It's the one that we keep track of every time we change the input field. This value changes. So that means that when we click post here, when we click the button for post, we're going to call this.props.onPost, and we're going to pass it this.state.content, which should be the latest text that's in that input field. So now when I reload this up, I've got to start up the app again. Let's do that. Oh, I type in good afternoon. I hit post. And down here it says good afternoon. So it's the, and actually I'm going to load up this debugger here, try and see if we can step through what actually is happening. So in my client.js, components, header, have all right here. This is actually going to be hard to set a breakpoint in right now. So what I'm going to do is try and get this. Great. So I type in good afternoon, and now I hit that post button. And that triggered this event right here. So we were passed in this event. And then we take a look at this. This is the header. This .props is an object that has an onPost method that we passed into it. And as a result, we get to call that onPost method with this.state.content, which contains this good afternoon. Okay? So this is the header component calling the function. When I jump into this function, when I step into this function, we're going to head on over to app.jsx. That's the file that loaded when I stepped into that function, because that's where the actual function exists. When we call onNewPost, we've just passed good afternoon into that. Then it logs out good afternoon. That's us passing a function that can be triggered. That's actions going up. Calling an action that triggers a function on the app component. Okay? So I hope that's clear. Should I go through that again? App passes a function to header. Header calls the function when it posts something. Because header does not know what to do with the data. It doesn't have a list of messages to add on to. It doesn't have access to that state. So we send this content to the component that does have access to that state through this function. Okay. App.jsx, take a look at this. We were on number 12. Okay, so we set up an event handler to use the function passed as a prop. That was in the header. We set up an event handler here, onClick event handler, to use that function passed as a prop on post. So I think we've done that. In the header, create the error state and pass as a prop to status. Okay, so we're not actually adding the posts yet. And the reason why is I think that we will add the posts once we actually hook up the real posts. Because right now, we'd have to create an object and all that. What we really want to do is call an API, /messages, post on /messages, pass it the data. It adds the message to our database. We then retrieve all the messages like we did in Tweeter. We display them. That's the ultimate, that's the goal we have. So for now, what we'll do is, now that we have this button that when we click on it, it will try and post that content, we can actually create that logic to create the error when someone doesn't post the long enough tweet, or it's too long or it's empty. So that's what we're going to work on now, and then we'll come back to actually using the method we created. So now we want to take this in the header. We want to create a state for the error. The error starts off as no error. We'll just put empty string. And then when we post, so when this function is called, we want to check to see whether or not the tweet is too long or not before calling this.props.onPost. So what I would tend to do here is I would say, well, I'm starting to put in some if logic in here, and I'm doing some more complicated stuff. So what I should do is actually create a function for this on post. And this takes in the event. And that is what's going to contain all of this stuff in it on post, okay? And then now, instead of doing this wrapper function that we had here, we don't need to do this anymore. Now we can pass it the onPost from this class. There's a this.props onPost, and there's a this.onPost. I want to confuse those things, even though I left them named the same intentionally to confuse you. Because I think that we should be able to do this. I think that we should be okay with calling a function onPost here, calling a function onPost that's in our props, and know that those things are different. I think that's okay to work towards that. So here on post, that's local to this function. That gets called on the click, which means we get an event back. And here we can say if this.state.content is equal to empty string, then we want to set this we want to set the state error to tweet must, or tweet cannot empty. Is that an okay message, right? If the tweet content is empty, if the state is empty, if this content in the state is empty, then we set the state here, this error, to be tweet cannot be empty. Now, we're not using that yet, but we can down here, we can say that this error, this status bar gets an error, and the value of it is this.state.error. So in this case here, when it's empty string, it'll render an empty string. It has tweet cannot be empty, it'll render that instead, directly from this message right here. Else if this.state.content.length is greater than 140 characters, then we want to set the state to tweet is too long. Else, we want to pass that state up to the other component, and then we want to set the state to be content empty, so that when we post this thing, it actually clears out the text field. And that's what it's doing here. Is if things are not good, we set an error. If things are not good, still not good, we set an error. If everything's good, then we pass that content, this local state to this component, back to the app, and then we set this local state of content to empty, so that that input field is no longer has the message that we just posted. I'm going to try this now. Try this out. So we run this here. Pause the debugger, we reload it. Okay. No errors in our console. That's good news. Good afternoon. This should post. Not read property, state of undefined. That sounds familiar. Does that happen? Why am I doing this? Header.jsx. Look at it. This.state.con. So this.state. This is this again, right? It's this again. So what I haven't done here is I've not bound this.onPost to have the context of this be the header. So I can change that easily by binding in the constructor. Reload this. Good afternoon. Now I try and post again. Okay. It sent the message good afternoon down here. So it works in the good case. What happens if I post and there's nothing in here? Okay. See, because I've not actually changed my status bar to show the error, what we want to do is we want to make use of the React tools to look at the header and see, oh yeah, okay, this header actually has an error on it, right? Tweet cannot be empty. So let's make that header render this thing. Let's make the status bar render this thing. We've passed it down here. The error is being passed to status bar, but status bar not using it. This dot props, or let's say props dot error. Now, when I try and post, tweet cannot be empty. It's showing it there. Good. Okay. So that works. I say good afternoon. Test again. Okay. It says good afternoon down here, but tweet cannot be empty is still in there. How do you think we could fix that? Because that should actually not show that anymore because we were successful. That right? I could clear it. So I can clear the content anytime I want. And this is this is useful because actually it's the error I want to clear, right? Yeah, of course. So it's error. I set it like that, and now when I post a bad tweet, I get the message. When I post something good, it disappears. And that's sort of the result of us setting this error and then it re-rendering and sending that content, the error down to the status bar. Status bar has an empty string, so it renders an empty string. To us, it looks like we don't even care, right? Yeah. So does this logic make sense here? We've done our character counter, our submission post logic here in this on post call instead. Yeah, whereas here I don't want to set content to empty because we want to keep what they had already and then allow them to modify it. So yeah, so we get to choose here. And there's many different patterns we could follow. You'll notice that I repeated set state a few times. I could create variables where, for example, I say let error equal empty string. And then in here, instead of setting the state directly, I put error equal to tweet not be empty. Then down here, instead of setting the state, I say error is equal to tweet too long. And then down here, I say error is equal to empty string. And maybe I have to do it for content as well, right? Or maybe, let content equal this dot state dot content. Then down here, I'd say if the content is equal to empty, or if the content.length is greater than 140, then I will send that content here. And I will set the content also be blank here. And then I'm just going to do this dot set state error content. And this should do the same thing for me. Except I'm only calling I'm calling set state once in all cases, but I've only written it once here. So it's up to you if you want to do it either way. I kind of don't actually have I could probably think of like 4 or 5 different ways to do this, right? So the goal is that when we want something to change, we set the state with the data that we want to change. And it's still doing that in this case. In this case, content is going to still be set, but it'll replace it with exactly what we had already. So that's okay, right? In the other cases, it doesn't even try and replace it. So you kind of have to choose which pattern you want to follow. Let's just verify that I am correct, that this actually works. So we cannot be empty. Good afternoon. I post that. It works. I say I do it a bunch more times. Tweet is too long. Make the tweet shorter. Post it. Looks like it's still working. Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. So same logic, just a slightly different way of writing it out. I think either would be just okay. So here we show the error text if it's not empty. That's kind of done for us already. But we could do conditional rendering in here. We could say in the header, we don't really want, or in the status bar, we don't really even need to render this whole thing here. this whole thing if the error is empty. So I'll show you the difference here. It's hard to see because we need to actually look at this debug out, or this kind of debugger here, React debugger, to know what's happening. But the header, we'll notice that status bar down here only has the span for the counter. Okay? And that's because there is no error, so it doesn't even bother adding the DOM for us for that. Let's say that we created an error. Now we can see in here that it rendered the DOM elements for us. And the error has content, tweet cannot be empty. So I've done that using a form of conditional rendering here. This is using the logical AND operator. So what does, say, if true and true? What does that mean? Both are true. Both have to be true to pass. So this would be true, right? What about this? False. Okay. What about this? False. And now what's interesting about this is if it hits this false here, then it doesn't further. Which means that here, if this is false, then it doesn't go further. But if it's true, then you actually end up with the return value or whatever the last item was, which ends up being this React element. So it's actually really, it's a weird syntax, but it's really nice in React to conditionally render this way because we can fit it all on one line very easily. We can say that if this value is true, and, well, this is always going to be true because this is a React element and objects are truthy, right? So in this case, what we get is, as long as this is true, then what we actually end up getting back is this value here. It gets put in the DOM, everything's good. If this is false, then we don't get anything here. It ends up being null. So if you wanted to, you could also use a ternary operator here and say, if props.error exists, if it's not an empty string, then render out the DOM for it, else render null. This is how I could choose between one of two things right in line here like this. Okay? And this should behave the same in both cases. So this should actually behave the same way. My post, it says tweet cannot be empty. In my header, I've got a status bar. That status bar has an error down here. If I put a couple characters in, hit the post button, this thing here is going to disappear. It's gone. It's no longer being rendered. So that's one way to do conditional rendering. Two ways, actually. The documentation for this, it's called conditional rendering, so it's pretty easy to find. And what you'll notice is inside here, they're doing the inline if with logical operator here, which is they're saying if unread messages dot length is greater than 0, well then render out you have so many unread messages. So it's just doing a truthy check on this value here. If the unread messages length is greater than 0, then it will render out the H2 that says you have unread messages. Otherwise, it won't show that. It makes a lot of sense because if unread messages length is 0, it shouldn't show a message about that. So they've kind of shown an example there. It works because in JavaScript, true and expression always evaluates to expression. That's how it's working. True and React element resolves to React element, so it renders it. False and React element resolves to false, which doesn't render anything. That's a little bit about conditional rendering. I'll leave this. Good. So show the error text if it is not empty. We're doing that. Okay. Now we're going to get into actually interacting with the backend and using fetch instead of Ajax. Do we have any questions about what we've done so far in terms of the status bar, the error, and header, and all that. Is that pretty clear? More of the same, I hope. Okay. I'm going to go to the app here, and I'm going to read switch from hard-coded posts to JSON that uses the fetch AJAX call. I'd say that these things here are hard-coded. Right? I can't change them. I mean, I could type them in, but I can't programmatically. I don't know what to say. The point is that I want my data to come from the server. So I'm going to switch this over, and instead of importing posts like this, we need to, when the app loads, make a request to the server, and when the server comes back with data, we need to make our array contain that data. Is that good? Okay. So we want to know when this component is ready to go, when it's ready to take new data, to have set state called on it. Does anybody have an idea of when that could happen? Close. It's that same idea. We have a different way of doing it in React. Because we can do it per component. We can do like a component is ready. But it's not called component is ready. It's called component did mount. So this means that the component is mounted and ready to go. Okay? So I'm going to say that the posts, they start off empty. So now when we come to this page here, we get an input field, and our state says we have an array of 0 posts. So I want it to load up the post from the server and then replace that array of posts so that we can actually see it here. And I can do that inside of my component did mount. I can do something like, right? This is I'm not going to write this exactly, but AJAX messages. I want to call the messages API, and I want to get back this array of messages. Okay. So I need a way of doing that, and the way that's preferable if we're not including jQuery, we can't use AJAX if we don't have jQuery. We can use this thing that's built in now called fetch. There are many different options here. Axios JS library. Promise-based HTTP client for the browser and node. That seems useful. Axios is a good option. What else? Super agent. Yes. AJAX with less suck. I mean, I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but what I do like is I don't want a library that has all of jQuery just to do AJAX, right? So I would say that's less suck. A whole bunch of code that I force people to download that they don't need, that's unfortunate. So in that case, what we'll use is a library that's whole intention is to do these requests, and that's it. Doesn't matter about selection, does not matter about adding on-submit event handlers to anything. It does not care about any of that. All it cares about is making a request to a server and getting a response back. I use fetch for that. And I've created a helper library here in a file called api.js. And inside of there, I have one method called get that I pass a URL. And I have one method called post that I pass a URL and data if I want. Okay? So I'm going to use this api.get method that I've created. And behind the scenes, what it's doing is fetch. Fetch API. So it's a web API. It's built into the browsers now. And it provides a interface for fetching resources, including across the network. It will seem familiar to anyone who's used XML HTTP request. Does anyone use XML HTTP request? Everyone put your hand up, please. It's what AJAX is built on. AJAX uses XML HTTP request, but because XML HTTP request is hard to use, they wrapped it in an easier interface. Fetch is an easier interface to that same idea, but I don't think it uses XML HTTP request based on this documentation. Has a new API. It's a little bit nicer to deal with. So we're going to use that. I use that here, and I say I'm going to fetch this URL. Then when you come back with a response, I convert that response to JSON, and I give you back a promise that gets resolved to actually have an array of objects in it. Pretty nice. So inside here, I'm going to say API. I guess first I should include my API helper library. I'll do import API from lib api.js. So I've now imported this API library. And I can call api.get / messages. Then my messages come in. Maybe I'll call them posts here. And I'm going to console log those out. Now I make my request. As soon as the server loads up, as soon as the component is mounted, it calls api.get, and I end up with output that looks like this. That's the data coming from my server. And that came in through this call right here, and it's being logged through this call right here. So what that means is that in this app, I now have an array of posts. What can I do with my array of posts? Well, notice it's not showing them. What could I do to make those posts show up? So you mean down here in main? So I could, and I do. Actually, I pass posts. But it's this.state.post. I don't need to. So I can have the page re-render without me reloading it. What is it that, sorry? Go ahead. I don't have to, because this is a lifecycle method that the React library calls for me when it is mounted. We have confirmed that this function is getting called. Actually, if I go in here and I go to my sources, I'm going to go to the app. I'm going to go to this component did mount, and I'm going to set a breakpoint there, and I'm going to reload this page. So it's called this for me because React has mounted this component and all of its children, finished doing that, which means it can now go call component did mount on my component for me, and that's what lets me know. It's like an event. It's the component is mounted event, and I don't say on component did mount. I just provide a function that it knows to call. It's part of the interface for this class. Okay. So it's calling this, and when it finishes calling the API, there's a slight delay, but we get the data back from the server, and that contains a list of these posts. So I do want my component to re-render. How do I make components re-render? Louder, please. Set state. Yes, exactly. So I call set state, and what that means is I want to change the state of this component to have posts that's actually an array full of data now, rather than just be empty. We know it can render an empty list. We want to render a list of full components. So what I do in that case is down here, I say this.setState, because now I have the data that I need. I will trigger a state change. And I'm just going to say that you have new posts with the name posts value of whatever this post variable contains. Okay? Again, same as that's short. I've done shorthand. So we load the app initially. It has an empty array. When we get the data back, we want this to now be replaced with the posts that came back from the server. And that's going to cause a re-render, which will eventually get back to the post series. Post series will go through, map all that stuff, call, and map each post for us. We hit save here. Now, this has the data actually coming from the server. If we set this breakpoint here, again, reload this, yeah, it has nothing to render right now. Now it has the post to render. It's almost imperceivable how quick that is, right? The fact that it starts empty, it doesn't render anything, and very quickly we get a response back and we re-render it with that new data. This is what's great about React. You change state, it re-renders it for you. It re-renders the DOM for you. A lot easier than having to do a request, get that data back, and then call a function called render tweets that specifically knows how to go through and do those things. This takes care of a lot of that in-between part that jQuery doesn't necessarily do. So we've successfully made this call now. Okay. Come down here and I take a look, save the new post to the database, in app.jsx post handler function. So this is the function that we passed down here. We passed this to the header because the header shouldn't necessarily know anything about the API. The header knows that it calls a function called onPost, and when it calls that, done. It's done with it. Hands that content off over here. We want to do API.post. We actually want to send a message to the server, a post on /messages. I can show you this route. We haven't looked at that part of the server code yet. This server has a messages.js here. Inside of the post route here, that's the one, this is the one it's going to call. /messages, I promise you. But anyone who's done a midterm knows that we break this down into different files and then we map it here, right? So /messages, that goes to the messages route right here. The messages route is here, it's a post. So what we do is we find the user that has the cookie that I'm currently logged in as. Then with that user, we create a message for them. Create a message for that user with request.body.content. So what this is telling me is I need to pass in a variable called content on the body. That means in the post, that HTTP post. I know there's lots of posts here. That one. When I started this off, I didn't think about tweet posts and HTTP posts as being two things that would, right? But the idea is I want to do a post on messages. I want to pass this an object because this is my body data. Content is equal to, it's just content, right? I can use that shorthand here as well if I want. I can say that this content has the value of whatever content was passed in here. So I'm making a request to my server and I'm posting the body variables of content. When we get this back, we want to, for now, we'll just say tweet posted. So this will confirm whether or not we've actually got a response back or not. I'm going to refresh this, and I'm going to say good afternoon, and I'm going to hit post. And we'll just show you that this is being called here. Post, it triggers on new post, it passes in good afternoon, size, right? Then we do a request to the server to get the messages. We pass the content in. That's okay. So here, it's going to say tweet posted because we've got the response back from the server. And tweet has been posted. Okay, tweet's posted. Still says good morning. I refresh this. Now it says good afternoon, and that's from a few seconds ago. So this is the one from this morning. Wow, that's 6 hours ago. That's a long time. This one's brand new, a few seconds ago. So it's working. The only thing is it's not reloading our tweets every time we post, right? How do we fix that? It's close. It does ultimately mean that we do a set state because we need to now have this post in our new list of messages. But when I post to the server knows about this new tweet, but my client doesn't know about it yet. What did we do in Chatty when we posted, Tweeter when we posted a new tweet? Well, we stored it in the database. Yes, and then what? Then we fetched it from the database. That's not, and we're not doing that here. We store it, but we never fetch it again. So what we would need to do is do something like this, where we take this call here. After we've posted our message, we request all of the messages again, and we replace the post state with that new state that should have that new message in it. But I've just duplicated this code. I don't think that makes any sense. I think what we should do is create a method here, maybe called load. And load, what it does is all this stuff. Okay? But in here, we just say this.load when the component mounts, and then this.load when we posted a new tweet. So I don't have that duplication anymore. But it still does the same thing. It still gets the messages when I load the app and then when every time I post a tweet. Let's see if that works. Gooder afternoon. Question? Oh, I've got an issue. This dot load is not a function. Why would that be? Binding, yes, we're getting used to this, right? So it's saying this dot load is not a function. My assumption is that it is because the on new post does not have its context bound. But I can check this out, right? Like if I'm ever having trouble with this, I go down here and I say, oh, this is where my error is. Set a breakpoint. I reload it. And I say, goodest afternoon. Okay. This is an object. Huh. Tell me a little bit about this. Does this look familiar? So what is this in the case that we're at right now? It's not because we've used an. So one thing is we've used an arrow function here. So the context of this will be whatever it is inside of on new post. So on new post has its context of this set to an object that has on post. Does this look familiar at all? Object that has on post. Okay, if not, I can show you. Yeah, I can go. Yeah, so I can go back into this call stack here, and I can take a look at where this is being called from. And I can look at this object here, this dot props. Oh, I should. This. I'm going to try this again. But yeah, post it. This dot props. Does this look familiar? Okay. So the object that I was showing you before happens to be the header on props object that has an onPost method. And what's interesting is when we call this dot props dot onPost without binding this thing, then when we continue here, step into this other function, continue down, this is that object. So the context of this happens to be the object that this was called on, the props object of the other component. So I need to bind on new post. I need its context to be app. So I go in here and I say this dot on post equal to this dot on new post dot bind this. So now when we come in here, say please work, and we post it, the props is still being called through this object. But now the context of this is the app itself. That's what we want because the app has props, the app has state, the app has a load function. So now this dot load should work for us here. And please work, question, it did. The best app in the world. Now it updates for me because it does the post, it gets it back, and it renders it out. I can write it, yeah, write as many of those. So we've now done save the new post to the database in the app.jsx post handler function. That's this one, the post handler. On new post, we send that data to the server as body data. Then when we're done, when we get the response back, we reload our content using another API call to get all the messages. When that is done, we ultimately get the set state that we had talked about, is the trigger for re-rendering our application. Okay? Does that look good? That's how we do API in our app. I have a last section here called toggle the visibility of compose window. That was a requirement in Twitter. Right now, it doesn't do much, right? Oh, great, thank you for that. So the question is conditional rendering just for site performance? Conditional rendering in some cases is for site performance. For example, let's say I have a list of 1,000 items, and I only want to render what's currently visible on the page, because I shouldn't render stuff that's not, right? Point, it's a waste of reason. In that case, I conditionally render only things that were within a certain maybe Y value on the page. Maybe it has a certain location on the page. But a lot of times conditional rendering is used to decide whether or not we should render something or not, or if we should render one thing or another thing. So for example, let's say that you have a login button. You click that login button, you fill in a form, and you log in. Now you're logged into the app. Does it make sense for you to have a button that says login anymore? No, it makes sense to have a button that says logout. So we conditionally render the login button or the logout button depending on the state of whether or not you're logged in right now. That's one reason we might do it. Conditional rendering would also be something like if I'm trying to do visibility state. So when I click this button, I can show and hide the content window. Based on this question, I would go into my header here, and I would set some state. I would say visible false. Does it start true or does it start false? What do we say? That's up to you. You can set new requirements if you want. What do we like? Show or hide from the beginning. Show. Okay, visible set to true. So we've set the state to be visible, true, right? Now we identify the area of our DOM that we want to conditionally render, and in this case, it's the entire create section that we want to show and hide. If I get rid of this, it's gone, right? If I put it back, there. So this section here happens to be the part that I want to conditionally render based on whether or not this button has been clicked or not, toggling visibility back and forth. So here I add some of these tags because I need to conditionally render this. And I say this.state.visible and this whole thing here. So this is actually able to use break it down. So have that maybe there. So I kind of like to do this. So here what I'm saying is if the value of visible is true for this component, then render this stuff out. Otherwise, don't render it out. Okay, it's true, right? We set it to true by default. In React, I can go and modify my header state by simply clicking this button over here. So you can see it says a little visible true. By changing the state of my app, I'm now actually conditionally rendering this whole section. And I'm doing it by modifying the value of this.state.visible inside of header. And I can do it through these tools, which is really nice. I can actually even, in here, I can say, not a real. So I can modify it through this tool. It's very useful. So, but we don't want to modify it through the tool. We want to modify it through this click of this button. So we would hook up this button here. We would say this dot, let's say on content is going to be, or actually on compose. Let's call it on compose. This dot set state equal to visible should be, okay, what value we'll set it to false? When we click this button, we're going to set the state of visible to false. So now inside of here we say on click this dot on compose. Now, sorry? Okay, well we can see it, right? So when I do this, oh, I get an error out. It says, not read property set state of undefined. This again. This dot on compose equals this dot on compose bind this. Now it hides it. Now I click it, it's not showing it. Right, because I just set it to false, right? So how should I write this? And what does that do for us? It reverses the value, right? Because when it's true, we want it to be false, and when it's false, we want it to be true. So we're going to use what Chance is talking about here is this.state.visible. And we say not this. So if it's true, we get false back, and if it's false, we get true back, which is actually a really nice way of doing it, because otherwise you're saying if this.state.visible, then this.setState, visible, false kind of thing, else, like what's the point? We can do it all here. Beautiful, right? So we just say not this value, and it will toggle back and forth for us. So I hope, Mark, I hope that answered some of your questions about conditional rendering. If not, please let me know. But there are multiple reasons to use it. For the most part, it's going to be for showing and hiding certain things based on the state of your application. And other times, it's going to be showing and hiding things that the user might not need at that point, simply because it's not maybe in your viewport. For example, imagine if you had you call an API and it gives you back 10,000 different locations on a map, all of Canada. But you're looking at Vancouver. You should only render the markers that are in the area that we can see, because there's no point in rendering everything outside of it. That's performance wasted, right? So in that case, we would conditionally render only markers that fit a certain criteria, ones that are within a certain area. Even if we got a whole bunch of that back from our database, we might filter that out before we actually try and render it. I would consider that to be conditional rendering as well, because there is a condition as to whether or not those things render. Still slightly different how we would implement. We're not going to worry about that at all for Chatty app. We're not going to run into any sort of performance issue with this application, but it is really something to keep in mind as you're going forward, how to do high-quality React applications. We won't be able to get into performance measuring and stuff, but there are all sorts of tools that allow us to figure out how many times render gets called on a component, and if it happens too often. If it happens too often, there are ways for us to prevent it from happening, ways for us to fix it. React is actually not. We have to still do the work. I hope that kind of covers some of the stuff that we have seen from. It's 5 minutes to 4. Anything else I should go over? Anything you want? Let me know. Slide down or slide up? Like what? And what do you mean, like an animation? Oh, I won't be able to do that in 5 minutes. But we would use something called CSS transform React. It's actually yeah, and so, well, maybe we'll be able to. I mean, I don't know how much. If that's the only question, then we could potentially set that up. But you'd use a component like React transition group. And what you would do is you would wrap your component in this transition group, because the complexity here is that when we want to show and hide something, we're actually taking it out of the DOM when it disappears. So we can't start animating and then take it out of the DOM, because it will not finish animating. What this component does for us is it wraps it up, and it does the animation, and then it removes it when the animation's done. So it kind of takes care of that complexity for us. This is a React transition group. So animation is sort of outside of the scope of this week, but I know that Joel has done advanced lectures on it before. There might actually be some week 8 lectures about that. If you want to go into that in person, I would sit down with you and do that. No, that would be fun. I just don't know that we can get it working. Maybe let's try it. So we need to. That would means we need to include this library. npm install React transition. That works. It does. Okay. Now I'm going to take all this. I'm going to, I don't know, go to the header maybe. I'm going to set this up. So I'm going to import the transition. And then I've got my fade. figure we would just whole thing. Got rid of that. Complaining because I'm using this. They're using in their example. They're using a spread operator syntax on the object that is not supported in JavaScript. You have to build that into your Babel config to be able to use this functionality. So I'm just switching it over to the ES6 thing, which is actually called object assign. And what it does is it merges two objects. That anymore, and we don't. This will take these two objects and merge them together. I think that would. Build success. Prop is not defined. That's it. Okay, so they're saying. I think we could just pass it. And we just pass it our visibility prop. Let me work on that and then come back and talk to you about that. I can also send out maybe a code example if people are interested. I've gotten to work with people on their final projects. I just don't do kind of. Anything else you don't want to talk about? Good. What are you doing? Okay, still the last question. Good? Great. Thanks, everyone. That's mostly do. Okay. Have to. I see it. Not to 0. I hide this. Just the But again, yeah. So I mean, there are might be, yeah, and that really has to do with the stuff. Right. So stuff is inside.